Hello and welcome to EE333. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to take another look at file input and output and how it relates to our user class and the ability to ultimately store information persistently on the file system. In an earlier video, we created a file demo that allowed for us to write the contents of a user, or essentially the toCSV method, to the file system such that when your application closed, you still had that artifact, you still had that CSV file that kept the information for the user. Now, we've made a slight change in this video. I have went through and I have just simply changed the name of that demo from file demo to fileReaderDemo. So if you've not yet watched that video, I'd encourage you to do so. If you have watched the video, I would like for you simply to make this change so that in this video, what we can do is we can focus on the ability to read a file. And then to begin with, what we want to do is we want to create one more function here. We're going to follow the same function signature as we have earlier, and that is the public static void. And in this case, what it's going to be is it's simply going to be our file reader demo. And as the name would suggest, the goal is that we want to be able to read in the contents of our CSV file. And so this is an example CSV file that we created in the earlier video. In this case, it's just got two users in it, not that many. And it's got 5 fields or 5 columns in the CSV file. And so the idea is that what we want to do is we want to be able to sort of reconstitute or read or recreate our users using this file. So the idea is that we will read the file and then we'll create a collection of users. So what we're going to do first is we're going to go ahead and create a bunch of temporary variables that we're ultimately going to need. Some are going to be related to the file itself, and then some are going to be related to the parsing and to the storage of the objects that we are ultimately going to create. So to begin with, what we want to do is we want to start off with the main ones, the new ones that we have not yet seen. And the first is going to be, just like before, a java.io.file. And we're just going to call this one input file. Now, we are also not going to initialize it. We're simply going to declare it and then initialize it later. But we also want to have a file reader, so it's going to be a java.io.fileReader, and we're simply going to call this one input file reader. Likewise, as before, we want to go ahead and set this up with a try catch. And we want to simply catch the java.lang.exception. And what we'll do here is we will simply, I snuck in a set of parentheses I did not mean to there. We are simply going to go ahead and capture the java.lang exception. We're going to refer to it as EX. And the system.out.println is just going to result in printing the toString output from whatever that exception happens to be, because there will be possibly other exceptions other than those just related to the file. Remember that, once again, exceptions are not meant to be error handling. They're supposed to be exceptional events that we did not anticipate. Now, some of the other temporary variables that we're going to need are also a buffered reader, which is going to allow for us to read from the file reader essentially in chunks. This is a little bit different from your CSV background, or excuse me, your C background, and parsing files using parsing CSV files using C. So we have one more temporary variable here that we need, and that is going to be a buffered reader. And so in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to call this one our input buffered reader. And I would encourage you to take a look at the links associated with these classes so that you can sort of understand the purpose behind each one of them. In addition, we're going to need some temporary variables that you are going to be familiar with, not the least of which is going to be a line. And a line is just simply going to represent a line in the file. The idea is that we're going to read in the file line by line as opposed to character by character. And then we're also going to need to be able to store then the chunks of data once we separate it or split it by the commas. And to do that, we create essentially an array of strings that we are going to call chunks. And so this is going to store, or this stores, the strings after they are separated, or after the commas, or after they are separated by the commas, or parsed after they are parsed. So in other words, basically what we're going to do is we're going to take a line, we're going to break it up based on the commas. All right, and then lastly, we need a way of creating and storing that student, and then, or excuse me, that user. Okay, so ultimately we're going to have, we're going to parse a line, we're going to split it into multiple chunks. Once we've verified that we have the correct number of chunks, we're going to go ahead and create a temporary object, and then we're going to collect that object then into an array list. So that's sort of our big plan there. So to do that, we need two other temporary variables, or two other variables here. The first is going to be an EE333 user, and we're just going to call this one temp user. And we are, in fact, not going to initialize this because we're going to need to collect the information before we can initialize it. And then the next thing that we need is going to be an array list, and specifically we're going to need an array list of users. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to specify that it is an array list of user, and you can go ahead and specify this as an EE333.user. I would encourage you once again to do that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to call this one a temp array list. Okay, once again, could come up possibly with a better variable name there. And this, we do want to go ahead and initialize this one because we want to go ahead and create the new array list even though it's going to be empty. So in this case, use the constructor here of java.util.ArrayList, and specifically it's an array list of EE333.user. And you, in addition to the angle brackets, whenever you're calling the constructor here, you also need the parentheses. So remember that essentially this is a parameterless constructor. Now at this point, what we want to do is we want to figure out how do we open our users.csv. So the first thing that we want to do is inside of our try catch is we say input file is equal to new java.lang or java.io, sorry, file, and specifically then it's going to be our users.csv. And the reason that I like using this approach as opposed to just simply going straight to the file reader or the file writer is then this gives us the ability to do this right here. In other words, what we can do is we can check to see whether or not the input file even exists. Okay, so there are other ways to go about doing this, but this is the most straightforward here. So the first thing we want to do is just check simply, does the input file exist? If it does not exist, there's no reason to try to open it. So the first thing is if the input file.exists is equal to true, well, then we want to do something. Otherwise, we just simply have an else, and here we're going to do a system.out.println, and you can choose whether it's an error or a warning. Basically, no input file exists. Now, at this point, then we have our input file that we want. We then want to go ahead and call the file reader constructor. So the input file reader is going to be equal to the new java.io.file reader. All right. All right, and we want to provide to it our input file. My autocomplete, once again, is having a little bit of fun with me here for some reason. Not sure why my control space is doing this, but basically now what we want to do is we want to take that input file that we have in fact verified does exist, and we simply want to use it in the constructor for our input file reader. Continuing on with this, then we want to do the same thing now with our input buffered reader. And in this case, what we want to do is we actually use the input file reader as the input argument for our buffered reader. So sort of I guess you could say sort of a three-step approach here. So we need the file. Once we've established that we have the file, we need the ability to read the file. So we use the file reader, and then the buffered reader, you can sort of think of it as I guess you could say a spoon or a bucket that allows for us to scoop out the contents of a file in a metered way. Now, as always, once you have opened a file, you want to remember to make sure before you forget, you want to go ahead and close the file here. And so what we want to do is we want to take a look at some of the methods associated with these objects. And so you can see here that our input buffered reader has the ability to close the string. And you'll also see that our input file reader has methods associated with it. In this case, it has the ability to close and release the system resources associated with it. So this closes the file. One of them closes the file. The other one essentially closes the buffered reader. So this makes sure that it not only closes it, but releases any resources back to the system. Translation, it allows for another operation to be able to open the file, but also releases any memory associated with it. Now, from here, the approach is actually going to be very similar to how we did it in C. So this portion is going to be similar to C and fscanf, meaning that we are going to want to set up a while loop to read the contents of the file. So what we're going to have here is going to have a while. And much like when we used our fscanf to pick out pieces of the file, whether it was a string or an integer or a double, basically what we're going to do is we're going to assign to the line the results of our input buffered reader, and the input buffer reader is going to read a line out of the open file. So take a second to think about this and see what's happening here. So basically our input buffered reader is reading a line. It's then assigning that line to the line variable. And much like what we did in C, we want to make sure that the results of that operation are in fact not equal to null. Okay, so basically where we were looking for end of file in C, roughly the same approach here. We're going to continue to read the contents of this file line by line until we hit null. From there, what we want to do is we want to take that line and we want to break that line up into its chunks. So break the line into chunks using the commas as the separator. Well, once again, we're going to leverage some of the methods associated with a particular object. And in this particular case, we're going to look at the methods associated with a string, or specifically the instance methods associated with our line, which is a string object. And specifically, we're going to see that we have the ability to split a string based on a string or a regular expression. In this particular case, it's essentially going to be a string or a character. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to split that line by commas. And if you'll notice with the output for the split function, what we want to do now is we want to assign it to the chunks variable. So this split function returns an array of strings. At this point, we need to simply check to see how many chunks were returned by our split function. And to do that, it's actually pretty straightforward. We can simply say if the chunks dot, and in this case, what we'll leverage here is our length. If our chunks dot length is equal to, we have 5 columns in our file, we have 5 fields in our object. In this case, chunks.length equal to 5. What we're going to do is we're going to assume that we have the correct values. We're not going to do any error checking at this point, but at least we have the correct values, and in this case, the 5 values that we need to make up a user. And essentially at this point, you can do some additional validation. So what we would want to do here is, for instance, check to make sure that the username is in fact not null or an empty string. So things like, for instance, chunks, square brackets, 0, which would be the first column. What we would want to do here is we would want to check the length of the ID. So I'm going to put a little comment in here. Essentially, this is the length of the ID field, okay, or column. So hopefully you can see what additional checking you would want to do before you just blindly assume that you have a valid line in your CSV file. At this point, though, for this video, we're going to focus just on how do we essentially bring in the information into one of our users. So in other words, how do we create the information associated with our user? So what we can do here is we can create a couple more temporary variables. These are not necessarily required, but they are convenient. We'll have a string that is an ID. We'll have a string that is a first name, a string that is a last name, the int age, which we're going to initialize to 0, and then the ee333.user.status, status temporary variable, and we're going to just simply initialize that to the dirty, since we aren't sure exactly what it's going to be. So in this case, we'll just call it the dirty, or basically dirty's just saying that it's unknown. All right, from here then, once again, I'm emphasizing we're not going to do the validation here, but I definitely need you to be able to do it. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're simply, out of convenience, so that you can see how you would do the validation, is you would assign then each one of these chunks. So in other words, chunks 0 would become your ID. Your first name would be chunks square brackets 1. You can see here, basically, I'm just pulling the information out of the chunks, basically based on the order in which you would expect to see it in the file. So this is chunks square brackets 2. And now we get to the age, which means that we're going to have a little bit of an interesting time here, because if you notice, the age is stored as a string, but it is in fact an integer, which means that you need to use some of the integer methods, particularly the parse int. And the parse int is going to allow for you to pass a string, in this case, chunks square brackets 3. And this will convert the string into the corresponding integer. Once again, we're going to want to do some validation. You're also going to want to take some time and look at how this parse int function works, which brings us to our enum. And we're also going to want to handle that a certain way. In addition here, what we're going to do is we're going to introduce another try catch block inside of our first one. So in this case, we're going to catch still a exception. Okay, so the same type of exception. We'll see. We'll further refine this later, but for right now, we're just going to worry about catching this exception. I'm going to call this one an inner exception or a parse exception. And specifically what we want to do here is we want to try to parse now that fifth column or integer, index 4 column, and we need to try to parse it into the corresponding enum. And to do that, what you can do is you can leverage a static method associated with that status. So we use the status enum, and you'll see that the status enum has the ability now to convert a string into an enum using the value of method. So in this particular case, it's a static method. It's not associated with a particular instance of an enum. But what we'll do is we will convert chunks square brackets 4, and we will simply assign it to that status temporary variable. Now, we want to do a couple of things here if we do throw an exception here. The first thing, of course, is just simply do a system.out.println and simply print then our parse exception. Once again, we'll talk about different types of exceptions later. For right now, I just want to catch them and at least print them out so that you're aware that they have occurred. And then secondly, what you want to do is you want to go ahead and set the status to some sort of default value to indicate that there was a problem. And this is now hopefully where that dirty status makes sense, or at least starts to make a little more sense, because basically if you failed to parse the enum, in other words, for some reason the user put in something that you didn't expect as that fifth column, you would throw an exception, and at this point then you would say, I give up, I don't know what you were trying to tell me to do. In other words, I don't recognize that fifth column. At this point, I'm just going to say that it is wrong, broken, dirty, whatever you want to think of it as. Okay, so we can utilize these try catches in a number of different ways. In this particular case, it's essentially a way of us capturing an unexpected value. You could also do this using some string comparators. And do this manually, but we're going to leverage this built-in functionality of the value of function. Now, at this point, if you have survived this far, meaning if your code has successfully validated the first 4 fields and has attempted to parse the 5th field and was successful with it, you're going to make the assumption that you have a valid user. And in this case, what you want to do then is you want to say temp user is equal to new EE333.user. And at this point, then what you simply want to do is you want to provide the correct overload for your constructor. I do want to go back. I just recognize that I'm not getting what I'm expecting to see as far as the function signature here. Even though I have not completed the Java doc, I'll have to see exactly what's going on here. Ideally, what we would do is we would complete the Java doc, and you would be able to tell them a little more information about each one of the parameters. But in this case, we at least know with the function signature that I'm going to need to pass first the ID. The second one is going to be the first name. The third one is going to be the last name. And then lastly, the age. And then we also want to take a second to use or to attempt to set now the status. And so this is where that discussion from an earlier video comes into play, is do you want to be able to externally set the status of your user? In other words, does the user itself, is that object, is that the only one that can set its status? In this case, this is a great example of where you may want to be able to import and create a bunch of users using a file, in which case you may want to be able to set the status of an individual user. We'll come back to that and we'll have that discussion again. At this point, though, what you want to do is you want to add the user now to that collection. So add the user to our collection. And in this case, what we're doing is we're creating a new user. So to do that, we simply say, we have our temp array list here. We simply say temp array list dot add, and we simply add one of our temp users. Now, that's great. Basically, we can run through the while loop one line at a time, reading out of the file, parse it, create a new user, add it to an array list, but then how can we verify if we've actually accomplished anything? Well, what we're going to do is after we've closed the file, after we're sure that we've read in all of the information, we're going to set up another loop here. And what we're going to do is we're simply going to loop through each of the elements in our array list. And so to do that, we can create a temporary variable up here. And so I'm just going to simply say int index, much like what we would have done in other languages. And I'm going to set up a for loop, and our for loop is going to start off at 0, and it's going to continue while it is less than our array list dot size. And so the size gets us the number of elements in our array list. And at this point, then, we simply just increment through the array list, much like you would increment through any other array or vector. Once again, this is where our toString and our toCSV file, or excuse me, toCSV methods from our user class come into play, because essentially at this point, we can then just verify that we have successfully imported it by simply printing out all of the information about the user. So in this case, what I'd like to do is I would simply like to print using a system.out.print line, and I'm going to print out the value at the temp array list. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the get method, and the get method accepts a integer, in this case an index or the index. And the beautiful part about specifying the array list is of type user is that then we can go ahead and call the toCSV, the toFormat, and the toString methods of our user. So essentially what's happening here is the get method knows enough about what type of data we're storing in our array list that it returns a object of type user, which means that we can use the toString and the toCSV and the toFormat method of our user. So at this point, basically what we would expect to see is the users that we have stored in our user.csv file print it out to the command line in a different format. So hopefully you can see here that we've accomplished what our goal is. So the other thing I want to do, because I've got one last thing I want to show you after we run this, I'm going to go ahead and basically mention that this is the output from the temp array list. And at this point, I can get a little fancier if I want to, and maybe even put a table around it, or even put some barriers in between each one of our users. But at this point, what I'd like to do is I just simply like to write or run our fileReaderDemo and see if it works. I think we actually still have to modify our main. Yes, we don't have this up here yet in our main, so just take a second to copy and paste one of our switches here, changing it from our fileWriter demo to a fileReaderDemo. And then go ahead and build it one last time. And then let's go ahead and run our fileReaderDemo. And you'll see that we get the output from the temporary array list. And notice how we've done this here because our toString has a new line on it. Basically, we get an extra line. It's your choice if you want to include that or not. It's completely up to you. But in this case, though, you'll see that we've printed out our two users in the order that they were in the file. We've essentially imported them from the CSV format into an object. We've added that object to an array list, and we're now printing it out. But I said there was one last thing I wanted to point out, and this is actually where you'll discover that the array list that we were using in this particular demo here is redundant. Well, why do I say it's redundant? Well, because in our user.java, we decided to add an array list, which was a static variable. In other words, it was shared by all the instances of the user, or you can think of it as being tied to the user class, not to a specific user. And every time we ran the constructor, we added the user to the array list. Now, we've done that for our first constructor where we had the ID. We would simply add the user to the list. We've also done it for our second constructor. But let's take a second to go back and do it now for our third constructor. So in other words, what we want to do is whenever we run this third constructor, we want to simply increment the count. And we also want to do a users.add and whatever user we just created. So the idea now is that this array list, the users array list, is now going to automatically add our newly created user to that list. Well, what that means is that we can now come over here to our fileReaderDemo. In addition to printing out using the temp array list that we just created, what I want to do now is I want to have another system.out.println, and this time this is going to be the output from the users array list. And to accomplish that, I'm still going to go ahead and use my index variable. So I'm going to say for index equals to 0, index less than, and then instead of specifying the temp array list, what I want to do is I'm going to specify EE333 dot user, and I'm actually going to specify the get user. So in this case, I'm going to leverage the get users method to get that users array list, that static users array list that we have. Notice how this is tied to the class, not to an instance. And then, of course, I'm going to increment my index. And basically what we're going to do here Sorry, I specified get users, but I forgot to specify then the size here. So we need to specifically get the size of that array list. Now what we're going to do is we're going to have a very similar system.out.println, with the difference being that instead of using that temp array, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the static method ee333.user.getUsers. And at this point, what I can do is I can actually use the get method from the array list to specify which element in the array that I want to get. And then once again, since the array list is specific, in other words, an array list of users, I can then run my toCSV or toFormat or toString methods specific to the user class. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm using this class level array list right here, and I'm then getting a specific value out of it, and I'm running the toString method. So let's see if this results in the same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and build it. I'm going to come out here to the command line. I'm going to rerun my fileReaderDemo, and you'll see that I essentially can then import not only to an array list, temporary array list in my static fileReaderDemo, but by virtue of the fact that I'm using my constructor, I'm also essentially storing the users in that static users variable. So hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to email me, and thank you for watching.